So in the 1880s, our currency lads and currency lass have all migrated from the bush to the city, like Eeyore, Tigger and Kanga stumbling out of 100-acre woods and into downtown Gotham. Sydney had one similarity to the bush though. It was a land of nomads. In the outback, shearers and rouseabouts camped under the open skies as they trekked from station to station. In Sydney, workers shuffled from boarding house to boarding house and slept on the streets when they couldn't afford one. The close of every day saw a flood of people emerge from the docks and factories and into the hundreds of cramped boarding houses spread around the quay. The end of the mining boom had driven people into Sydney for work, but when the economic slump reached the city, there was nowhere else to turn. It created whole districts of unemployed single men looking for a job and a temporary roof over their heads. Melbourne didn't fare much better. The development surge and subsequent downturn saw the second largest city in the British Empire, and supposedly the richest city in the world, turn into what the editors of one Australian magazine very wittily called smell boom. Before moving to Sydney to live with his mother, Henry Lawson had most recently been working in the Blue Mountains with his father and a group of friends. There was a brief period of contentment for Henry, as he had found two outlets that greatly helped him bridge the massive chasm of awkwardness that separated him from other people. One outlet was storytelling, the other was alcohol, and both of them mixed together exceptionally well for him. With a bit of Dutch courage, he found he could not only talk with his friends, but enrapture them. To his father, though, who watched Henry sink further and further into the grips of the bottle, this was chilling. He telegraphed his now ex-wife, Lawson's mother, and arranged for Henry to move to the city to stop him from going too far down a dark path. In the city, Henry worked in a succession of odd jobs. He started as an apprentice coach painter, but in what was either a projection from his paranoid mind or a grotesquely cruel twist of fate, his co-workers taunted him as balmy, the same stinging insult that he'd endured in the classroom. Henry later wrote some short stories set in the city, featuring a young main character called Arvie Aspinall. In one, Arvie works at a factory with other children, where he's nicknamed Barmy Arvie by his co-workers. After a day of miserably toiling alone at work and enduring the mockery of his peers, he returns to his house with a heavy heart, and then dies in bed. So, that might give you a little bit of insight as to where his head was at. Here's how he describes this period of his life, when he was working thankless city jobs before he found his fame as a writer. I worked about in various private shops and did a bit of house painting too. I knew what it was, when I was out of work for a few days in winter, to turn out shivering and be down at the Herald office at 4 o'clock on bitter mornings, and be one of the haggard group striking matches and running them down the wanted columns on the damp sheets posted outside. I knew what it was to tramp long distances and be one of the hopeless crowd of applicants. I knew what it was to drift about the streets in shabby and patched clothes, and feel furtive and criminal-like. If Lawson's working life was unfulfilling, his home life was something of a mixed bag. He was living at this time with his mother, Louisa, a woman who was described by his future wife, Bertha, as having a tall, commanding personality. Louisa, I mentioned before, was unsatisfied with her life in the bush, and decided to separate from her husband and strike out in the city, which was a pretty gutsy move in the 19th century. She was a very brilliant intellectual woman, Bertha said. Not at all domesticated, in any sense. Ambitious and high-spirited, she was an intrepid and fearless battler in the cause of the advancement of women. I think the women of Australia do not realise their great and lasting debt of gratitude to her. She championed every cause that would improve their condition and worked tremendously hard in pioneer movements against glaring abuse. Strong-minded, self-willed, and of exceptional intelligence, she was particularly fitted to carry the banner of progress in those early days, when a woman's interest in public affairs was looked upon with disapproval and suspicion. Now, I previously described her as headstrong and cantankerous, which I think is fair, but I also agree with Bertha in thinking that Louisa tends to get a bit of a bad rap. When she's remembered, it's predominantly in relation to Henry Lawson, and Henry tended to view his mother either through the lens of his parents' separation, or as one of several people who attempted to control him, and in particular his drinking. As he told it, often through thinly autobiographical stories like A Child in the Dark and A Foreign Father, when he was a child his mother henpecked his overworked father into a trance-like state of living death, and endowed young Henry with all of her anxieties. In between these periods of relentless hectoring, His sister said that their mother was prone to strange fits of abstraction in which she would vegetate for days. But it was Louisa's fire and Louisa's persistence that introduced Henry to the world of literature and journalism. She was the one who petitioned for a bush school to be opened for him to attend. She was the one who read to him as a child, from books she managed to source from God knows where, while living in the middle of nowhere. And it was Louisa who first published her son's writing. He was rather afraid of the chieftainess, as he called her, while admiring her fine qualities, said Bertha. Mother and son stood shoulder to shoulder for years on the farm, and later in the city. She fostered and encouraged his literary abilities, but she could never have given him the sympathetic understanding or affection he most needed. I think this helped to increase his sense of loneliness and nervous diffidence as a boy. Louisa was able to publish Henry because, after she moved to the city, this single mother from the bush launched her own magazine empire. In 1887, Louisa and a few of her friends went in on buying a fledgling magazine called The Republican. Under the French Revolutionary-ish banner of liberty, fraternity, equality, the magazine pushed for Australia to unify as an independent, great republic of the southern seas, free from British control, and a young Henry Lawson was an early contributor. 1887 was a smart year to start a Republican magazine. Discussion was once again ramping up around Federation, and with 50 years on the throne, Queen Victoria was celebrating her Jubilee. Lawson penned a poem called Song of the Republic that was published in a magazine called The Bulletin, his first work to appear in a publication not owned by his mother. It goes, "Sons of the South, make choice between. Sons of the South, choose true. The land of morn and the land of e'en. The old dead tree and the young tree green, the land that belongs to the Lord and the Queen, and the land that belongs to you." Of this poem, Lawson would later say, "It was my first song, and sincere, written by a bush boy who was a skinny city work boy in patched pants and blucher boots, struggling on the edge of the unemployed gulf." The following year, in 1888, Louisa Lawson launched her second publication, The Dawn. This is from her editorial in the first issue. "But where is the printing ink champion of mankind's better half? There has hitherto been no trumpet through which the concentrated voice of womankind could publish their grievances and their opinions. Men legislate on divorce, on hours of labour, and many other questions intimately affecting women, but neither ask nor know the wishes of those whose lives and happiness are most concerned. Here then is Dawn, the Australian Woman's Journal and mouthpiece, phonograph to wind out audibly the whispers, pleadings, and demands of the sisterhood. Here we will give publicity to women's wrongs, will fight their battles, assist to repair what evils we can, and give advice to the best of our ability." The magazine was soon staffed by a team of all-women editors and, remarkably, all-women printers, which rubbed up both conservatives and unionists the wrong way. The conservatives were annoyed at the feminist messages being pushed, while the unionists said they were annoyed by the female printers because women weren't allowed to join unions and so therefore the workplace was non-union, but most likely they were also pretty mad at the feminism. According to an article in Dawn about the magazine's early years, the members of many of the unions refused their custom to the shops which advertised in Dawn. They forbade their wives and daughters to take it in, and even went so far as to offer personal violence to these brave but defenceless women, who were obliged at last to seek police protection. Louisa later recounted how a journalist from a publication called Christian World entered the Dawn office to borrow a print block, but then outstayed his welcome and began harassing the staff. "Well, he stood there and said nasty things, and poor Miss Griggs, she's my forewoman, and the girls, they got as white as chalk. The tears were in their eyes," said Louisa. "I asked him 3 times to go, and he wouldn't, so I took a watering pot full of water that we had for sweeping the floor, and I let him have it." Except for one outside contribution, the first issue of Dawn was filled entirely by Louisa's writing. She also organised the printing and secured the advertisements by going door to door. From there, the magazine exploded in popularity, and she ran it for 17 years, using it as a platform for civil rights issues like suffrage, unjust laws around divorce and inheritance. "No sanctity can remain in marriage bonds which only bind to torment," she wrote, as well as publishing short stories, poetry, and articles around fashion and cooking. My favourite section was a delightfully Victorian precursor to Kids Say the Darndest Things, called Droll Sayings by Children. An example of that being, Herbert, aged 4, to the postman after receiving a budget of letters for the elder members of the family. "I say, postman, I wish you'd bring me a letter too tomorrow, if you don't mind." This was the environment that forged the Henry Lawson we remember today. The chip on his shoulder provided the fuel, and his mother's magazines and social circle helped him find the outlet. In 1888, he followed up his Song of the Republic with another submission to the Bulletin, a poem called Faces in the Street, a dark missive about Sydney's underclass, and also, I think, a timeless tale about the horrors of making eye contact with people. "I can sorrow for the owners of the faces in the street. The city grinds the owners of the faces in the street. Grinding body, grinding soul, yielding scarce enough to eat. Oh, I sorrow for the owners of the faces in the street. I wonder, would the apathy of wealthy men endure? Were all their windows level with the faces of the poor? Ah, Mammon's slaves, your knees shall knock, your hearts in terror beat, when God demands a reason for the sorrows of the street. The wrong things and the bad things and the sad things that we meet in the filthy lane and alley and the cruel, heartless street. Then, like a swollen river that has broken bank and wall, the human flood came pouring with the red flags over all, and kindled eyes all blazing bright with revolution's heat, and flashing swords reflecting rigid faces in the street, pouring on, to a drum's loud threatening beat, and the war hymns and the cheering of the people in the street." Meanwhile, good old Banjo is having a grand old time. If Lawson paused at all to lift his eyes from his shoes and take a look around when he dropped his poetry off at the Bulletin, he might have noticed an office building right around the corner. It was the office building that in 1888 became home to Sydney's newest legal firm, Street and Patterson. When we last saw Banjo, he had moved to Sydney to start as a clerk in the legal offices of a family friend. He was admitted as a solicitor in 1886 and launched the Street and Patterson legal firm in 1888, decorating the office with bush memorabilia like stuffed birds and possum skin rugs. I mentioned before that, roughly speaking, our characters are growing up in a country that's gone from a massive boom to a protracted bust. But while recession is hard on many industries, it's great for the collections letter writing business, and that happened to be Banjo's bread and butter. As he put it in his reflections, his early time as a lawyer involved screwing money out of people who didn't have it. Or, as he put it in one of his many poems about lawyering, "The loss means ruin to you, maybe, but nevertheless I must have my fee, for the lawyer laughs in his cruel sport, while his clients march to the bankrupt court." As it was with Lawson, writing was an outlet for Banjo, an outlet for his frustration at being stuck behind a desk all day, away from all the horses, and a convenient platform for him to gently lampoon the highbrow, white-collar social set he was mixing with. He poked fun at wealthy colleagues and acquaintances in anonymous poems, but he had no ethical objection to joining their gentlemen's clubs, playing polo with them, and using their clout to get ahead in business. But that's not to say that Banjo Patterson was apolitical. In addition to being around the corner from the Bulletin, a magazine that strived to be as outrageous as possible, his legal offices were around the corner from some of Sydney's nastier boarding houses, and his 9-to-5 of writing letters on behalf of banks to squeeze money out of people who didn't have it did get under his skin. In 1885, the year before officially becoming a solicitor, he sent his first contribution to the Bulletin, the magazine that had also published Henry Lawson's pieces. Banjo's piece, El Mahdi to the Australian Troops, was an outcry against Australian participation in the war in Sudan, a messy, vicious conflict that demonstrated the extent of Britain's carelessness when it came to maintaining order throughout all of the lands it had so eagerly invaded. The war was by no means universally unpopular. It was seen by many Australians as a just and noble retaliation against foreign treachery and extremism. You can still see a generous statue to Charles Gordon in Melbourne, the man whose death kicked off the war. The statue was put up by public subscription, which means that people themselves raised the money to fund it. But to a lot of people at the time, the dispatch of Australian men to mop up after British incompetence by murdering the native inhabitants of a faraway continent, all just to help the British continue pilfering Africa, that was exactly why our colonies needed to start standing apart from the rotten, bloated motherland. As Banjo put it in his work, "Men of Australia, wherefore have ye come? To keep the puppet Khedive on the throne? To strike a blow for tyranny and wrong? To crush the weak and aid the oppressing strong? regardless of the hapless fella's moan, to force the payment of the Hebrew loan, squeezing the tax like blood out from the stone. It was a bit rich for a lawyer who went on to work on behalf of banks as they were literally forcing the payment of loans, Hebrew or otherwise, to make this kind of rallying cry. But in this case, as with many others, he used a pen name. The name he eventually stuck with, Banjo, was, as I said, originally the name of one of his horses. It was a clever pseudonym because the idea of a talking horse who was occasionally racist would not be a thing in popular culture for roughly another 80 years.
I'm worried about Wilbur as a Chinese waiter.
Banjo's most ambitious attempt at political writing occurred just after he became a solicitor, and you can tell he took it very seriously because he put his real name to it and it doesn't even rhyme. It was a painfully sincere pamphlet outlining what he saw as the biggest injustices facing Australians and how to fix them. Banjo wasn't blind. He was clearly affected by the poverty he saw on the streets of Sydney, and in the pamphlet he earnestly uses various horse analogies to convince readers that there had to be a better way. He said, "The improvement in productive power has been like the speed of a racehorse, while the improvement in the position of the people who ought to be benefited thereby has been like the speed of a mud turtle, if indeed any progress has been made at all." In the introduction, he talks about how, in an attempt to understand how the other half live, he decided to slum it for a night in one of Sydney's boarding houses. "Let those who do not see the necessity for any change or questioning of the present arrangement of affairs take a night walk around the poorer quarters of any of our large colonial cities, and they will see such things as they will never forget," he wrote. "They will see vice and sin and misery in full development. They will see poor people herding in wretched little shanties, the tiny, stuffy rooms fairly reeking like ovens with the heat of our tropical summer. I, the writer of this book, at one time proposed, in search of novelty, to go and live for a space in one of the lower-class lodging houses in Sydney, to see what life was like under that aspect. I had roughed it in the bush a good deal. I had camped out with very little shelter and very little food. I had lived with the stockmen in their huts, on their fare, so I was not likely to be dainty, but after one night's experience of that lodging, I dared not try a second. I fled. And yet what I, a strong man, dared not undertake for a week, women and children have to go through from year's end to year's end. This piece of forgotten writing, one of the earliest in his literary career, is notable for how idealistic Banjo is. If it is the dream of a visionary that in such a country every man might be comfortably off and might get a living easily, certainly, and with a large amount of leisure, then God help the people of such a country. They deserve to have it taken from them and given back to the blacks." If you liked that last sentence, he also dropped a hard R N-word in there as well. But for all that passion, his actual suggestions were pretty underwhelming and amounted to tweaking the way public land was leased by the government to stop early speculators and absentee landlords rake in money from their land while doing nothing with it. It didn't set anyone on fire. As Banjo himself said, it fell as flat as the great inland desert. So he left political writing for Lawson and the others, and doubled down on what he was good at, bush erotica. And by that I don't mean romantic pairings happening within the bush, I mean that kind of eroticization of the bush. The flood from the country to the city and the widespread feeling that Australia was stepping into the future was fertile ground for stories that celebrated the real Australia of the outback. In 1890, Banjo published 2 pieces in the Bulletin that cemented his legacy as the poet of this Australia: The Man from Snowy River and Clancy of the Overflow. The framing device of Clancy is specifically about a guy in a city office fantasizing about how much better life would be out in the bush. It was inspired by a collections letter Banjo sent to the outback. Elsewhere in 1890, in one of the boarding houses that so alarmed Banjo Paterson, the fairy dust of young love was swirling around the Lawson family home. Mary Gilmore, then Mary Cameron, had started to drop by the Lawson household and had hit it off instantly with Henry. "It was a strange meeting, that between the young Lawson and me," she later wrote. "Tremulously we met, for we were both exceedingly thin and overstrung. He nervous because he thought me a scholar, I humble because I knew him a genius. Afterwards, he said he fell in love with me at first sight. 'But I am not pretty,' I said. "It was your eyes," he answered. Their mothers were already friends, having bonded over their similar circumstances and their shared love for political and literary discussion, and Mary and Henry found that they also had a lot in common. They were both highly intelligent, perceptive, driven young people who were born in rural Australia and witnessed the corrosive effect of the bush way of life on families and individuals. Their mothers were both writers, who had both left their fathers and moved to Sydney. Their mothers had also nurtured their intellects and ambitions, feeding them a steady diet of Defoe and Dickens that had led to a lifelong love of reading and writing. But personality-wise, they made quite a contrast. Mary was strong-willed, confident, and domineering, while Lawson was quiet, tormented, and self-destructive. Mary, as she stated once in her diary, loved manly men. Balmy Henry, for all his talents, was not that. There was a curious immaturity about Lawson at that time, Mary later said. He was in the sappy twig stage of development. The handsome face and masculinity of later years had not then come into being. The face was weak, the chin underdeveloped, the look as effeminate. Mary, with her fuller education and skills as a teacher, taught Lawson how to use a dictionary to help his writing. Henry, in return, gave her walking tours through some of Sydney's seedier areas. In a little time after the first meeting, Henry came out almost every evening, Mary said. We used to go out and walk. At this time it was still customary for a man to give his arm to a lady, and Henry offered the arm I expected. So hand in hand, in a way like two children out of a book, we did the streets of Sydney, and I look back and know we were children. So innocent and so eager, so young and so fresh in ourselves. He used to take me out to see the wrong things, the low-wage workers, the Chinamen working at treadle saws in underground cellars, lit only by a grating in the street, the huddled houses by the old Argyle cut, and the rocks, where women hung their washing out on the roof and from windows, and where pale seamstresses sewed at a foot or a hand machine from daylight till dark for a few pence. And last but not least, the mixture of blood and the neglected children of the quay and elsewhere. Mixture of blood here referring not to literal blood on the streets, but to interracial relationships. You know, your typical second date stuff. Later in life, after Lawson had died, Mary said that he fell in love with her at first sight. And judging by what we know of Henry's life and character, he did seem to fall pretty hard for almost any woman who gave him the time of day. But Henry's mother was not a fan of their budding romance, and when Mary moved into the Lawson boarding house as a tenant, it's fair to say that she drastically shook up the already off-kilter family dynamic.
Mother, please.
And then what? After supper, music, whispers?
Mother, she's just a stranger. She's hungry and it's raining out.
Mother, she's just a stranger.
Shut up! Shut up!
In May of 1890, 2 months after Mary moved in, Louisa sent Henry away to Western Australia with his brother. But a lot of people, including Mary Gilmore and Henry Lawson's sister, believed that this was to throw a bucket of cold water on her son's crush. According to Mary, Henry asked for her hand in marriage just before he left for WA, and he suggested that they elope together. But she said that some sense of unfitness, some realization that I was not ready for marriage, made me say no. While they were apart, Mary sent letters to Henry, but Henry's replies were intercepted by his mother and hidden away. And so with the distance between them, and the lack of communication, whatever romantic flame had been kindled between Mary Gilmore and Henry Lawson slowly sputtered away and died out. Lawson's poem, Rejected, written just a few years later, is thought by a lot of people to be about his relationship with Mary Gilmore. She says she's very sorry as she sees you to the gate. You calmly say goodbye to her while standing off a yard. Then you lift your hat and leave her, walking mighty stiff and straight. But you're hit, old man, hit hard. In your brain the words are burning of the answer that she gave as you turn the nearest corner and you stagger just a bit. But you pull yourself together, for a man's strong heart is brave. When it's hit, old man, hard hit. To zoom out a bit from Lawson's broken heart, in 1891 the entire country was engulfed in a sensational drama that was euphemistically referred to as the Great Shearing Difficulty. It was a battle between the forces of organised labour and established capital that had tremendous cultural and political ramifications, as well as being a massive turning point for Mary, Henry and Banjo. For several years leading up to the difficulty, the squattocracy, those who owned the sheep stations and the more lucrative farms, had been sliding unstoppably towards a confrontation with the roving shearers and labourers who worked on their runs. The schism between the two camps had been steadily deepening and deepening, and in January 1891 the unhappy marriage between bosses and workers finally snapped in two. The union movement in Australia had a rich mythology, born at the Eureka Stockade. Following the end of the gold rush, the influx of miners into shearing and farm work injected the loose community of bushworkers both with ample foot soldiers and with the ardent unionist ethos of the goldfields. Meanwhile, the economic downturn had taken its toll on the pastoralists and station owners across the country. As small sheep runs and selections went belly up, they were gradually incorporated into larger and larger property portfolios run by increasingly powerful owners. After a few years of hard times, the Darwinism of the market had created a much more concentrated squatocracy, one that could wield its collective power with more precision and force. The precursor to the Great Shearers' Strike happened the year before, in 1890, as Banjo was publishing his Odes to the Bush and Henry and Mary were taking romantic miscagination walking tours through the slums. Wharfies on the docks refused to handle packages of wool generated from non-union labour. The alliance of the city-dwelling stevedores with outback shearers caught businesses by surprise and dealt them a harsh blow, which was eventually crushed by using non-union workers to load the ships. But while the unions eventually lost this battle, there was blood in the water, and the stage was set for a more decisive showdown on a much larger scale. For their part, the squatters saw how much fun the union members were having in their little gangs, so they decided to make their own club. In December of 1890, they formed the United Pastoralists Association, which allowed them to present a united front against the unions, and put out an alternative view for how workplaces should be run.
We feel strongly that, once you learn the facts, you'll decide that having a union at Target might benefit the union,
but it's not in the best interest of the company or the team members.
refuse to sign, and keep Target union-free.
In 1891, the Pastoralists Association crafted a new working agreement that would be presented to all shearers at the beginning of their contract. It rejected the union principle of the closed shop by leaving the door open to foreign and non-union workers. It also didn't mention anything about the 8-hour day, a relatively new and hard-won union cause. In response, the union blew the war trumpets and put out the call for workers to walk off the job and begin forming camps. From Logan Downs and Gordon Downs, the strike spread through Queensland like wildfire. On February the 1st, under the branches of a giant ghost gum tree in Barcaldine, the strike committee composed the Bushman's Official Proclamation. Fellow Unionists, we call upon you all, individually and unitedly, to pull the unions through this fight, let the cost be what it may. Here in the bush we have no voice in the making of the laws and no share in the government. We are disenfranchised and denied all rights as citizens. We have only our unions to which we can look for justice, and if our unions go down, we are totally enslaved. The main strength of the union force was at a camp at the Blue Bush Swamp, 3 miles from Barcaldine, where 1,000 people gathered in tents under the Union Jack and Eureka flag. But at the height of the strike, there were an estimated 10,000 unionists camping out, many mounted on horses, and altogether armed with about 800 rifles. Here's a report from The Age about what the main camp was like. The meeting place is at the Barcaldine end of the camp, against a tree flying a flag of freedom under the Southern Cross. The flag is a bit ragged, and no wonder, for it is never taken down. Behind this spot the camp reaches for several hundred yards among low timber and scattered scrub on the slope of a sand ridge beside a swamp. The shearers' camp is made up of little low-pitched ridge tents, of mixed shapes and sizes, clustered among trees and brushwood, and half hidden by sheds and shelters of gum boughs. One can tell at a glance something near the strength of the force, but the shearers' camp has such an independent, erratic formation that it gives very little idea of the number of men it carries. The camp committee, whose tent is a rather superior bit of canvas in the middle of the camp, enrolls members for the ration list, looks after the management, and provides axes, shovels, and other camp tools for general use. The tents are mostly smaller and poorer than the navvies' tents, common to Victoria, for the shearer here needs his tent only while camping between sheds, and for many months of the year, a man needs scarcely a tent at all in this climate. The reading room, or recreation hall in the Barcaldine camp, is a good specimen of bush building, fitted with seats and tables of saplings and rough packing cases where the men read or play cards, chess and draughts. Their lending library was roughly built, at first with bits of old bags and tattered canvas, but a neat new tent has taken its place. Some 600 books of all sorts are collected here and issued on loan under the authority of the librarian. When there is rain, however, you can scarcely conceive a more dreary outlook. 48 hours rain will paralyse the traffic for a fortnight, and when the sun comes out there is a hot, steamy atmosphere, which is very unhealthy when it combines the effluvia from camps and townships. There is no sanitary system about the Union camps, and it would not be surprising if fever broke out. Their drinking water drains over the surface among all the offal of the camp, and some of the tents are pitched on wet ground, where ditches and walls have had to be made to drain the water off. With its band, library, regular cricket matches, and subpar hygiene practices, the camp must have seemed like a kind of outback music festival. But the Union camps were an intimidating show of strength from a community that was usually dispersed and nomadic. The average shearer travelled most of the year, alone or in small groups, at distances of up to 300 miles between sheds. When they stopped moving and banded together, it was a visual reminder of just how big the workforce was. The message was not a subtle one. One union leader said, "The only certain method for working men to get justice in this country is by becoming expert in the use of the Winchester rifle." Another leader, W.G. Spence, famously claimed that if the shearing party wanted to overrun the government in Queensland, they could easily do so. They could muster 10,000 of the best riders in the world, men with whom the Mexican cowboys were not in it, and men who were splendid rifle shots. They could, many of them, bring down kangaroos at 300 or 400 yards and put a bullet on every spot on the 6 of hearts, one after the other, with the revolver. Against such a body as that, what use would be the 1,000 disciplined men, which was the limit of the Queensland government force? But despite the militaristic words bandied about on both sides of the divide, the shearing strike was not intended to be a physical battle. It was a war of attrition and a war of public relations. The shearers hoped that by withholding labour from station owners and making it difficult for them to bring in non-union replacements, they could bend the squatters over a barrel. Sheep needed to be shorn, and the overhead costs of running a massive sheep station that's been ground to a halt are a lot higher than the overhead costs of a single labourer pitched up in a tent waiting for a fairer contract. At the same time, the shearers hoped that by banding together in large organised camps, they could press their cause to the public. A largely invisible population of workers finally had the spotlight and could use it to convince the metropolitan populations of Sydney and Melbourne, as well as the politicians and business owners who might rarely set foot in the outback, that their cause was a just one. And they knew that if they were seen as thugs or bullies, this battle would be impossible to win. To balance out the army of angry unionists on their doorsteps, the colonial governments dispatched a total of 1,400 troops and 58 armed constables to various hotspots across Queensland. They also brought along some heavy artillery in the form of a Nordenfeldt machine gun and a 9-pound field piece. Soldiers and policemen were used to guard the trainloads of non-union labourers from Victoria that were being freighted in by station owners to work the runs, and were continuously marched from town to town in response to various union uprisings. It wasn't a war, it was kind of a game. One side had to transport trainloads of workers as safely and secretly as possible to a series of isolated, vulnerable farms with limited communication. The other side had to try and prevent, intimidate, or sabotage these trips without provoking the government into an all-out gun battle. So it's understandable that over months of this type of brinksmanship, nerves on all sides got quite a bit frayed. A letter from the secretary of the General Labourers Union at Clermont during the strike reads, "Things are quiet in Clermont. First shot fired there may be the cause of the Australian Revolution. The men are very determined here and anxious to be at work. What work, I leave you to imagine." A telegram from a police inspector in Barcaldine to the commissioner outlines the fears on the other side of the barricade. Saltern and other woodsheds to be burnt, dynamite put under the government buildings, rails pulled up should free labourers come up, boundary fences and dams cut, arms to be procured from across South Australian border. Inspector Ahern, Sub-Inspector Dillon and Senior Constable Malone to be first shot. Chance secret society being formed here. But while violence wasn't in the interests of those in the camps, to Australians reading the newspapers at home, it seemed like the country was mere moments away from an all-out civil war. On February 21st, the Brisbane Courier asked, "Are the revellers of the gay season in London and Paris to be told by the swift-running tape of Morse transmitter that the industrial Armageddon has been fought in the heart of Australia, in a locality which a score of years ago was an undiscovered country? Yet true it is that on our great western plains the opposing forces of civilization and revolution are gathering, and conflict is inevitable." The papers breathlessly printed apocalyptic dispatches from the pastoralists, like this one from station owner W.G. White at Thylungra. "The country here is in a state of revolution. Men are afraid to keep their places. My men all leave today. Free labour will be stopped by force." The reporting from the ground, especially from correspondents embedded with the troops, made it sound like they were riding from the thick of the Tet Offensive in Vietnam. Here's one from the Brisbane Courier that follows the boggy journey of a squadron led by Captain Boyd, who had said of the trek, "But any man who could not cross Australia with 2 shirts and a couple of pairs of socks had better not don the Queen's uniform." The troops which left Brisbane by train this morning arrived at Yandina at 2 p.m. The train took them 2 miles beyond Yandina, and then a march of 8 miles had to be made along the railway line in blinding rain, the ground being in a fearful state. The force arrived at the 80-mile peg at 5:15 p.m. after a terribly trying time, the mud being knee-deep in places. The stragglers took some time in coming in, and this delayed the departure for Gympie till 6:30. 2 of the men were knocked up. They are to be left here. The train arrived at Gympie at 8:30 p.m, and a crowd of over 400 persons gathered at the station and received the troops with hoots and groans. On the men leaving the train, the crowd became so threatening that Colonel French ordered the men to fix bayonets and advance at the charge. The way was then soon cleared, and the men formed up and marched to the drill shed, still followed by the same crowd, hooting and jeering. There were several confrontations like this over the course of the strike, with trainloads of soldiers or non-union workers surrounded by hundreds of angry, shouting unionists and their sympathisers, making cries like, "None of them will go back, we will send their scalps to Victoria." But what the troops mostly witnessed was the aftermath of the shearers. Here's another report from someone who accompanied the soldiers. Captain King from Toowoomba, with Lieutenant Thorne and 27 mountain infantry, arrived here about 2 o'clock on Monday morning after a long day's march of 65 miles. They knew their enemy was in front of them, and it was quite necessary that they should be here before them if possible. Captain King and party found all the gates on the Oakwood Run taken down, chopped into pieces, placed alongside of the posts they had previously hung to, and burnt. They also found all the fences cut down and the grass set on fire along the road. On the infantry arriving at a boundary rider's hut 20 miles from the head station, they found the dog-leg horse paddock on fire, and the boundary rider tried hard to persuade Captain King not to go any further that night, saying that the road he would have to travel was fearfully scrubby, and that the Unionists might fire on him when he was in the scrub. There is no doubt that the Unionists made this man promise to try and keep the infantry back till the morning, but Captain King, seeing what damage the Unionists had done all along the road, considered it his duty to be at Oakwood before them, and very pluckily tackled with his men 20 miles of very ugly, scrubby road. The mob of Unionists, in all about 70 men, made their appearance about 2:30 o'clock on Monday afternoon. They first pulled up about a quarter of a mile from the head station and deliberately set fire to the grass, with police, infantry, and the owners of the place looking on. They then marched through the gate within 200 yards of the house and began hooting and yelling, while some of their mob chopped the gate to pieces. They then started in one mob to march towards the woolshed, where the shearing was going on quietly, and which is about 100 yards off the main road to Tambo. Inspector Stewart and several of the police rode up to the mob to find out what their intentions were. Delegate Fanning told him that he wished to come to the shed to see the shearers. This he was told he could not do, and if he attempted to do so, Inspector Stewart informed Fanning that he was sure it would lead to bloodshed. Wherever the troops and policemen weren't, there were reports of farm animals being shot, fences being destroyed, telegraph lines being cut, and train tracks being blocked. Whole swathes of Queensland were set on fire, though the green grass and unusually wet weather stopped the flames from spreading too far. The pastoralists clamoured for more and more armed protection, but the government was simply unable to effectively hold dominance over such a vast and sparsely populated area. There are about 80 police in the vicinity of Clermont, but this force is totally inadequate, said one report. Many of the stations are 30 miles apart, and if they should have to be defended, would make but a poor show against the overwhelming force of the armed Unionists. If the latter proceed to extreme measures, it is probable that a fearful solution of the difficulty is not very remote, as many of the ringleaders are stated by the pastoralists who know the district to be the scum of the western country, reckless and desperate men. It seemed like the whole of Queensland was a powder keg, waiting to explode. But the shearing difficulty of 1891 ended with a whimper, not a bang. There were some close calls, stones were thrown, bayonets were drawn, effigies were burnt. A Unionist called Fanning became infamous due to his impressive ability to start roaring fires in the wet green grasslands. Another man called James Martin started turning shear blades into pikes by attaching them to the end of poles, and started publicly campaigning for their use against their enemies. Both of these men were pretty roundly condemned by most of their comrades. The Unionists were fairly effective at policing their own. Those out-of-work shearers who left the camps to drink and start fights in the towns were hauled back to the camps to sober up before they could escalate things any further. For all the sound and fury, there was a remarkable absence of actual fighting. There was only one death in the entire conflagration, and that was more sad than anything else. A worker called James Ryan was stabbed in his sleep by his friend Tom McLeod, who was babbling on about how the Union wanted to kill him, and was most probably suffering from some kind of mental illness. As the months stretched on, people started trickling out of the Union camps and back to the shearing sheds. Some went back to work out of desperation. With Union funds running dry, they needed to put food on their plate. Many had grown disillusioned with the movement, and believed that the Union had severely overplayed its hand. Non-Union labourers continued to flow in from elsewhere in the country, and Union efforts to intimidate them or convert them to the cause proved fruitless. The railroad tracks that Lawson once observed had tethered the Great Bush to the world ended up proving pivotal in breaking the strike, by allowing easy passage for non-Union workers and police reinforcements. At the same time as the last remaining Unionists were celebrating one of the first May Day workers' rallies, 14 of the ringleaders were hauled before court. The strike was dying around them, and by the end of that month the last of the embers had been squashed. The shearers' strike had a profound effect on Henry, Banjo and Mary. It was the shearers' strike which spurred Henry Lawson to write one of his most famous poems, Freedom on the Wallaby. This is the poem that was read out in Parliament to the shock and disgust of the members. For Banjo Paterson, the shearers' strike laid the foundation for his most famous contribution to Australian culture, Waltzing Matilda. And Mary Gilmore was one of the many Australians who were truly devastated by the disappointing result of the strike. She believed that the strike demonstrated that Australia was simply incapable of becoming a society that valued workers. Despite the youth of the colonies, we were still too enmeshed in the old, corrupt British way of doing things. For Mary, it was pointless trying to change things from the inside. It was time for a new approach. Following this new approach would take her all the way to Paraguay in South America, where she would join a socialist commune led by one of the loudest supporters of the shearers' strike, a man called William Lane.